Today, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case about whether former President Trump can be on the ballot in Colorado. The case involves significant questions about how to interpret Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And joining us now is NTD's legal correspondent, Arlene Richards, live. Good evening, Arlene. You had a chance to listen to some of these arguments earlier today. Give us a sense for how the court may be leaning.
Good evening, Steve. I think the court is leaning toward keeping Trump on the ballot. Now, a majority of the justices voiced concern about the potential backlash this could cause if the states are allowed to decide whether candidates can be disqualified. But there were some interesting exchanges on whether there was an insurrection on January 6th. So let's listen to that.
The Colorado Supreme Court concluded that the violent attempts of the petitioner's supporters in this case to halt the count on January 6th qualified as an insurrection as defined by Section 3. And I read your opening brief to accept that those events counted as an insurrection, but then your reply seemed to suggest that they were not. So what is your position as to that?
We never accepted or conceded in our opening brief that this was an insurrection. What we said in our opening brief was President Trump did not engage in any act that can plausibly be characterized as insurrection.
All right, so why would this not be an insurrection? What is your argument that it's not? Your reply brief says that it wasn't because I think you say it did not involve an organized attempt to overthrow the government. So
that's one of many reasons, but for an insurrection there needs to be an organized, concerted effort to overthrow the government of the United States through violence.
Focused on whether states have the power to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment on their own without waiting for Congress to pass a statute that would trigger enforcement.
So, Arlene, tell us what Section 3 states and ultimately what Trump's legal team is arguing here.
So, Steve, this case is completely reliant upon the language of Section 3 and how the court interprets it. So the general understanding is that the law prohibits certain people who previously took an oath of office from holding future offices if they participated in an insurrection. It's also called the disqualification clause, which is what the challengers want to happen in this case. They want Trump to be disqualified from the ballot. The relevant language of that law states, no person shall hold any office under the United States who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. So what the attorneys have argued is that the president is not an officer of the United States. President Trump did not engage in insurrection. Only Congress can enforce this section. What the Supreme Court has to consider today is the president an officer? Did Trump engage in an insurrection? Is Congress required to enforce Section 3? And at the end of the day, this is an election case that the court's decision will potentially have a major impact on future presidential elections. Steve?
NTD's Arlene Richards, thank you for that report. And tonight, the Nevada Republican caucuses will be taking place. Former President Trump will be the only major candidate on the ballot. The caucuses run from 8 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Caucus goers can either stay for the entire duration or simply cast their ballots and go. Although Nevada is holding both a primary and caucuses, only the caucuses will award delegates, and candidates can take part in only one single contest. Nikki Haley chose to participate in the primary on Tuesday. Her campaign said that's because the caucuses were, quote, rigged for Trump. Haley finished second in that primary behind the ballot option, quote, none of these candidates. On the Democratic side, author Marianne Williamson on Wednesday suspending her presidential campaign. She finished third in Nevada's Democratic primary on Tuesday. And Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota now remains the sole Democratic challenger to President Biden. Former President Trump expressing optimism today as liberal and conservative justices alike sounding skeptical of the Colorado ruling to keep him off that ballot. Meanwhile, the Justice Department today declining to charge President Biden for his handling of classified documents. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. First, if you could, tell us about Trump's reaction to today's Supreme Court hearing.
Good evening to you, Steve. Former President Trump today sounded optimistic about where things are going next, calling the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court today a beautiful thing to watch, and adding that he believes his team's arguments were very strong. And he also again bashed the case itself from the Colorado state, saying that is election interference. Watch.
I consider it to be more election interference by the Democrats. Can you take the person that's leading everywhere and say, hey, we're not going to let you run? You know, I think that's pretty tough to do, but I'm leaving it up to the Supreme Court.
And Trump went on to accuse President Biden of weaponizing the government, alleging that every one of these cases comes out from the Biden White House. We know that President Biden has previously denied such allegations and saying that he has not even once told the DOJ what to do or what not to do. Meanwhile, another development today again prompted President Trump to allege election interference and also calling out what he called a two-tiered system of justice. Special counsel Robert Hur today declined to prosecute President Biden, even though saying in a new report that President Biden, quote, willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. And President Biden welcoming that decision today while saying that he was a lot more cooperative when turning in those documents. Watch.
But I was especially pleased to see the special counsel make clear the stark differences between this case and Donald Trump. According to the indictment, he has not only refused to return documents for many months, he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then lie about it.
But the DOJ report also unveiled new details about Biden's foggy memory, even citing it at one point as one of the reasons for why President Biden's not getting prosecuted. The report says during interviews in the investigation, President Biden did not remember when he was vice president or when his son Beau Biden died, among other details. The White House responded by saying that it does not believe the report's treatment of Biden's memory was accurate or appropriate. Steve.
NTD's Iris Tao reporting live from the White House. Thank you, Iris. So why isn't the title of president listed in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? That was the question even some of the Democrat-appointed justices on the Supreme Court asked at oral arguments today. We spoke with a Colorado Republican candidate for Congress and chairman of the state's GOP about what he witnessed inside the High Court's chamber. Dave Williams, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, Dave, you came all the way from Colorado. How significant was today for you on a personal level, but also for your state and the Republican Party there?
You bet. This was an extremely important case, and I was honored to represent my party and be in the Supreme Court chamber as the justices grappled with this novel legal theory that is, quite frankly, ridiculous. But they were professional. They were all class acts, and they asked thoughtful, deliberative questions that got to the heart of the issue. Ultimately, the questions they were asking was, does the 14th Amendment, Section 3, apply to President Trump or any other president for that matter? And I think what you're going to see in the next 2-3 weeks is that they're going to conclude that this case is something that should never have been brought before them, and they're going to overturn the Colorado decision.
And Dave, so from what I gather right now, it appears, to your point, a lot of those more deliberative questions were actually coming from some of the liberal justices. So could it be possible that we see a unanimous result here in favor of former President Trump?
Right. I mean, you never want to predict how a court's going to adjudicate and then ultimately rule. But from what I witnessed with my own two eyes, it looks like that this is a pretty clear-cut and dry case. I mean, when you have justices that were appointed by Democrat presidents asking the obvious question, how come the title president isn't listed in the enumerated list of offices that would include the disqualification for Section 3 in Amendment 14, then I think they see the writing on the wall. This is something that doesn't apply to President Trump, and didn't even get into the insurrection itself, right? I mean, there was a lot of debate on what does it mean to have engaged in an insurrection. Different states could have different standards. If we actually affirm the Colorado decision, then does this open up the door for other states to kick off Joe Biden in retaliation? to this decision. I mean, these were all thoughtful, good questions that I think are ultimately leading to a favorable ruling for the Colorado Republican Party and ultimately Donald Trump.
And Dave, speaking of other states, what will this mean for the other states such as Maine and others who are, either filing similar suits or are waiting to see what happens with this one?
Well, this question was posed to the petitioners, and I think the answer ultimately was it depends on how the Supreme Court rules. They could very well narrowly rule this to only apply to Colorado, or they could make a nationwide sort of ruling that applies to everyone else that's grappling with this question. Ultimately, I think the Supreme Court is going to settle it once and for all. They're going to put the issue to bed, and they're going to provide clarity on this. And what you're going to see is, I think, what every normal common sense person knows, that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was never intended to be used 100 plus years later, post-Civil War, on a billionaire former president who clearly didn't engage in insurrection. And we look forward to that ruling in short order.
Dave, what does this mean, I guess, when you start to think about potential election interference?
This is absolutely election interference. I think that's been apparent from the very beginning. You have desperate Democrats or never Trump folks that just want to do everything they can to stop Donald Trump from getting back into the White House, especially given the bad economy that we have, the crises around the world. Everyone knows that Joe Biden is unfit to serve, and when the rematch comes back with Donald Trump on the ballot, he's going to win, and probably win in a landslide.
Does Colorado have any chance of going red in the upcoming election?
It's trending in the right direction. We saw a recent poll that showed Donald Trump gaining some steam. So I think, there's only so much people will tolerate, and Joe Biden is certainly on his heels. It's going to be a referendum on him, and we think we're going to win the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.